Before we begin, we publish new content every day. So be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. I drove 9 hours through the California hills to get to my son's engagement dinner. My hands cramped from gripping the wheel and my heart full of anticipation. When Ethan opened the door of his San Francisco apartment, I expected to see the warmth in his eyes that I remembered from his childhood. Instead, he looked puzzled, almost annoyed. "Oh, Mom," he said. Scratching his head like I was some unexpected delivery. "He forgot," he ordered. "We had the dinner yesterday. Didn't I tell you it was moved up?" Standing there in my good dress with a bottle of champagne and the family heirloom necklace I'd planned to give his fiancée, Rachel. I felt something crack inside my chest. 9 hours of driving. 3 days of preparation. A lifetime of showing up for this boy. And he couldn't even remember to tell me the plans had changed. The hallway felt like it was closing in as I processed his casual indifference. The way he was already glancing back toward his living room, where I could hear the television playing. "I'm sorry," I managed to say, though I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for. Being there? Caring too much? Existing in a way that inconvenienced his new life? Rachel appeared behind him. Beautiful and polished in that effortless way young women have. "Oh, hi, Mrs. Patterson," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Ethan told me so much about you, though apparently not enough to remember to include me in their celebration." The drive home was a blur of highway lights and questions I'd been avoiding for years. When had I become so disposable to my own son? When had my presence become something to be managed rather than welcomed? I thought about all the times I'd rearranged my life around his needs. All the ways I'd shrunk myself to fit into whatever space he had left for me. The next morning brought clarity along with my coffee. I sat in my kitchen looking at the photos on my refrigerator. Decades of pictures where I was always the one behind the camera. Always the one making sure everyone else was captured and remembered. I realized I couldn't remember the last time someone had taken a photo of me that wasn't a polite afterthought. My sister Margaret called that afternoon, asking how the dinner went. When I told her what happened, the silence on the other end stretched long enough for me to wonder if the call had dropped. Finally, she spoke. "Katy. Honey. This isn't the first time something like this has happened. Remember his graduation when he forgot to save you a seat? His birthday last year when he double-booked dinner with you and his friends?" She was right. And hearing it laid out like that made me realize I'd been making excuses for him for years. I'd been so focused on being understanding, on being the accommodating mother who never complained, that I'd trained my own son to treat me as optional. The pattern was clear once I allowed myself to see it. That evening, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and liberating. Instead of calling Ethan to smooth things over, instead of finding ways to excuse his behavior or blame myself for being too sensitive, I chose silence. Not the cold, punishing kind, but the kind that creates space for clarity. I needed to understand who I had become in my eagerness to maintain our relationship at any cost. The days that followed were difficult in ways I hadn't expected. I kept reaching for my phone to text him, to ask about his work or share something I thought he'd find interesting. Each time, I stopped myself and asked a different question. When was the last time he had reached out to me first? The answer was uncomfortable, but illuminating. A week passed before Ethan called. "Mom, you've been quiet," he said. And I could hear genuine confusion in his voice. "Are you okay?" I realized that my silence had done something my years of accommodation never could. It had made him notice my absence. "I'm fine," I told him. Which was true in a way it hadn't been for a long time. "I'm just thinking about some things." "What things?" he asked. And for a moment I heard an echo of the little boy who used to climb into my lap with his questions and concerns. But I also heard the man who had learned to take my presence for granted, who expected me to always be there regardless of how he treated me. "I'm thinking about what I want my relationships to look like," I said. "What I'm willing to accept and what I'm not." The conversation that followed was the most honest one we'd had in years. I told him how it felt to drive 9 hours to be forgotten. How it felt to always be the one adjusting. Always be the one understanding. I told him I loved him deeply, but that love couldn't be one-sided anymore. I needed to matter in his life in a real way. Not just as someone who would always forgive and forget. Ethan was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. Smaller somehow. I didn't realize. "Mom, I guess I just always knew you'd be there. So I stopped thinking about whether I was showing up for you too." It was the beginning of something new between us. Though I knew it would take time to rebuild what we'd lost through years of imbalanced giving and taking. Meanwhile, I began to examine other areas of my life where I'd fallen into similar patterns. My neighbor Mrs. Chen, who had somehow become accustomed to me watching her mail and watering her plants whenever she traveled, but who never seemed to think to check on me when I was sick. My book club, where I always volunteered to host, but rarely felt like my opinions about the books we read carried much weight. I started making small changes. When Mrs. Chen asked me to collect her packages during her next trip, I politely explained that I had other commitments. When the book club automatically assumed I'd host the next meeting, I suggested someone else take a turn. These weren't acts of rebellion or revenge, but acts of self-respect that felt foreign and thrilling. The most challenging part was learning to sit with the discomfort of disappointing people who had grown accustomed to my reliability. Some relationships shifted and found new equilibrium. Others revealed themselves to be more about convenience than genuine connection. Mrs. Chen, for instance, grew noticeably cooler when I was no longer available at her beck and call. But new spaces opened up in my life. I joined a hiking group where my enthusiasm for nature was welcomed and matched. I started taking a pottery class, something I'd always wanted to try but never made time for because I was too busy managing everyone else's needs. My hands, which had grown stiff from years of housework and caregiving, learned to shape clay into beautiful, imperfect vessels. 3 months after the forgotten dinner, Rachel called me directly for the first time. "Mrs. Patterson," she said, her voice careful and respectful in a way it hadn't been before. "Ethan and I are planning our wedding, and we'd really love your input. We were wondering if you'd like to help with some of the planning." I could hear Ethan coaching her in the background. and I appreciated that he was trying to bridge the gap between us. But I also recognized this as a test. Would I slip back into my old patterns of saying yes to everything? Thought of being grateful just to be included? Thank you for thinking of me, I said. I'd be happy to help with specific things that interest me. Why don't you send me a list of what you need? And I'll let you know what appeals to me? The silence on the other end told me this wasn't the enthusiastic, unconditional yes they'd expected. But it was the beginning of a new kind of relationship. One where my participation was chosen rather than assumed, valued rather than taken for granted. Later that day, Ethan called me himself. Mom, he said, I want to apologize again for the dinner thing. But also for all the other times I didn't show up for you the way you showed up for me. I've been talking to Rachel about it, and we both want to do better. His words meant something because they came with action. He started calling me regularly, not just when he needed something, but to check in, to share parts of his life, to ask about mine. When I mentioned my pottery class, he asked to see photos of my work. When I told him about a difficult hike I'd completed, he responded with genuine admiration rather than the polite interest I'd grown accustomed to. The wedding planning became an opportunity for us to practice this new dynamic. When they asked for my help with flowers, I said yes because I genuinely enjoyed working with flowers. When they asked me to handle all the guest accommodations, I said no and suggested we hire someone professional. Each boundary I set was met with initial surprise, then growing respect. 6 months later, I found myself in a place I barely recognized. My calendar was full, but with activities I'd chosen rather than obligations I'd accepted out of habit or guilt. My relationships were fewer but deeper, based on mutual interest and respect rather than my willingness to accommodate everyone else's needs. The most unexpected change was in how I saw myself. For years, I'd defined my worth through my usefulness to others, my ability to anticipate and meet their needs. Learning to value my own needs and preferences felt like learning a new language. I discovered I had opinions about things I'd never allowed myself to consider. I preferred morning hikes to evening walks. I liked abstract art more than landscapes. I enjoyed the company of people who asked me questions and listened to the answers. The wedding was beautiful. And for the first time in years, I felt like a guest rather than unpaid event staff. Ethan and Rachel had asked me to give a short speech. And as I stood before their friends and family, I felt proud not just of my son, but of the journey we'd both taken to get to this healthier place. I talked about love that grows and changes, about relationships that require tending and intention from both sides. I talked about the difference between loving someone and enabling them, between being supportive and being a doormat. I didn't mention the forgotten dinner or the years of one-sided accommodation. But I think everyone in that room understood that something important had shifted in our family. As I watched Ethan and Rachel dance their first dance as husband and wife, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: genuine contentment with my place in the world. Not because I'd finally earned someone's attention through constant giving, but because I'd learned to give and receive in equal measure. The night before they left for their honeymoon, Ethan came to see me. "Mom," he said, sitting in my kitchen where we'd had so many conversations over the years, I want you to know that I'm proud of you. For standing up for yourself. For teaching me what it means to really show up for someone you love. I'm sorry it took me so long to learn. I hugged my son. This man I'd raised, but who had also, in his way, helped raise me into someone stronger. We both had growing to do still. But we were finally growing in the right direction, toward each other rather than away. With intention rather than assumption. With love that was offered freely rather than demanded through guilt or habit. A year has passed since that forgotten dinner. And my life looks completely different. I've learned that protecting my own needs isn't selfish, it's the foundation that makes it possible to love others authentically. I've learned that teaching people how to treat me isn't mean, it's necessary for healthy relationships. Most importantly, I've learned that it's never too late to change the patterns that no longer serve us. At 63, I discovered that I still have the power to write new chapters in my story. To be the author of my own life, rather than just a supporting character in everyone else's. The woman who drove 9 hours to a dinner she wasn't invited to feels like someone I used to know, someone I'm grateful to have been. But even more grateful to have outgrown.